Good evening. Welcome to Kentucky Tonight. I'm Renee Shaw. Thank you so very much for joining us. Our topic this evening, AI, artificial intelligence. There are some mixed opinions about it. Some people think it's a breakthrough that will improve efficiency and make people's lives better. Others are worried it will take millions of jobs of all types and even threaten human supremacy. To discuss all of this, we're joined in our Lexington studio by Trey Knatzer of the University of Kentucky Center for the Enhancement of Teaching and Learning, State Representative Josh Bray, a Republican from Mount Vernon, and Donnie Piercy of the Google Earth Education Experts Network and the 2021 Kentucky Teacher of the Year. Joining us by Skype, Dr. Roman Yampolsky, University of Louisville Professor of Computer Science, author, and AI safety and cybersecurity researcher, and State Representative Nima Kulkarni, a Democrat from Louisville. We do want to hear from you tonight. Send us your questions or comments by Twitter at KY Tonight, KET. Send an email to kytonight@ket.org or use the web form at ket.org/KY Tonight, or you can simply give us a call at 1-800-494-7605. Well, welcome to all of our guests near and far. It's good to see everyone. Hope you had a great holiday week before for the 4th of July. We were off then, but we hope you all enjoyed your time with your families and celebrating our nation. So let's get right to it. This is a complicated topic. I think, Representative Bray, this is one of those things that I don't think I can read enough about to learn about. And so we're going to defer first to Professor Yampolsky to give us a primer about what AI is, what does it encompass, and where is it right now?
It's been a dream. It's been a dream for many years. The goal is to create an equivalent of human capability, both cognitive and maybe physical, to robotics. So automation of labor, automation of science, automation of all sorts of different capabilities. And for many years, it didn't work really well. We had narrow systems. Maybe they could play chess and nothing else. Over the last 6 months, maybe a couple of years, we actually started to see systems which are general. They can do many things. They can help you with your homework. They can write poetry. They can translate, program, all sorts of things. So we're starting to see what some people think is early stages of artificial general intelligence. A system as capable as a normal person or maybe even a smart person. Next level would be use of those techniques for automation of research. So science, engineering to develop more advanced AI. And that would get us to superintelligence, systems smarter than all of us. And that's where real fun begins.
I think that last part, Professor Yampolsky, about systems being smarter than all of us gives many people pause. And I want to go to you, Dr. Trey Knatzer, to ask you about that. UK, University of Kentucky, for which you work, they are really embracing this. You even have a group or an effort that really helps organize and coalesce around this in a positive way. But when you hear that there could be systems that are superior to humans, that gives a lot of people some heartburn.
Well, and the idea, what we're doing at University of Kentucky is, in fact, to engage those kinds of hard questions really directly and look at what's emerged in the last 6 months as a kind of opportunity to consider where the place of the human still is in this world where things have become, as the professor was just saying, perhaps more automated and sophisticated and have leapt in sophistication than ever before.
Right. So there are humans, though, who are creating this artificial intelligence. Why would, maybe it's not a goal, but why would an inadvertent goal or be to have them be superior to humans? Is that a goal?
Well, I think our goal is to think about how we can leverage this technology in a way that enhances some of the goals that we have as a university, and other institutions of higher education are doing the same thing in terms of prioritizing things like student learning, the research enterprise, the service mission, and healthcare, for example, so that the platforms that are automating a lot of these really sophisticated and difficult thought processes, for example, looking at massive amounts of data or considering language at a scale that a human brain can't possibly comprehend, can augment and help us think through things in ways that we maybe couldn't do before.
So I want to go back to Dr. Yampolsky to ask about, 60 Minutes, they actually rebroadcast on CBS just last night, the segment with Scott Pelley about AI. And there was a segment about robots who were playing soccer, right? These miniature robots. And they actually had learned strategy. And in the beginning, I think many of us thought that this technology was singular in nature, that they're given a specific task and they can't go beyond that. But when you look at what these robots were able to do on the simulated soccer field, they were actually able to critically think about how to block and how to make the goal and all of those things. So that's where we are, right?
No, we're well beyond that. Soccer is trivial in terms of strategy. What makes it difficult is the physical aspect, robotics. In terms of strategy, we have AI which outperforms humans in games of strategy such as Go. It's also, I think, better at games like strategy. Also, it was able to solve difficult scientific problems, for example, protein folding. So in many domains, it's already superior to our best efforts.
So when you think about terms of national security, cybersecurity is what you also have expertise in. Are there concerns about this technology being a bridge too far?
Of course, it's capable of independently discovering zero-day exploits. It can write novel code. It's also very good at social engineering attacks. Now with proliferation of generated content, deepfakes, videos, pictures, those systems can simulate your boss, your spouse, your friend. If before you had to generate a spear phishing email by reading emails, by trying to figure out who you are, and still a lot of people clicked on those malevolent links. Now you can send a video to millions of accounts of someone they know and really trust, telling them, hey, what's your password? I need some money sent to me. So it's a nightmare in so many different ways.
Yeah. In the education space, Mr. Piercy, we know that ChatGPT, which many of us think doesn't really flow very fluently off the tongue. We have to practice that. But that's become in the academic world, and you can speak to this too, Professor, about how this has become a concern, but perhaps not for you. Perhaps this is something that we've talked with you before for our Newscast Kentucky edition about how you and your classroom is embracing.
So when I'm looking at AI, whether it's ChatGPT, Google Bard, whatever the next iteration of AI is going to be, I want to look at it as an educator. How can this tool be incorporated into my instruction? And how can that better the student learning and engagement that takes place with my students? So whenever I first discovered ChatGPT for the first time back in November, I think I accidentally discovered it the day after it launched through a friend, started to play around with it, and I immediately recognized that things were going to change in the way that technology was going to be brought into the classroom. And at that point, I started to ask myself as an educator, okay, so how are lessons going to be different? What is an activity designed with AI? What would that look like? How is it going to be better? And more importantly, when you think about the students in your classroom, how can you use this tool to better the instruction that they receive?
And protect the academic integrity.
Oh,
right?
for sure.
I mean,
and it's no secret, and I'm speaking as someone who, when I was 17 years old, if this existed, I would totally figure out a way to try to use it as part of my, my education, I guess you could say. But all that aside, you can't, if a student is using ChatGPT, and they are, trying to use it and pass it off as work as their own. There's an issue there, but I don't think that means that we as educators immediately need to shy away from this technology, because it's not going to go away, and it's only going to get better. And it is very, very important that we figure out different ways that we can incorporate this tool so that way we can better our profession and really ultimately better the lives of our students.
So how are your fellow educators responding? Are they embracing it as well and positively as you are?
Well, I think even as much as I love educational technology, I'm still approaching using AI in a kind of intentionally being very hesitant about it. We even have days when I've told my students, I'm like, we are not using technology today. We're going on a walk just to get away from all this stuff, to give our brains a break from it. But you know, in the education space, I think understandably there's people who are having some tough questions, and a lot of times it's for that, almost like the dehumanization that will come from using AI. You know, in theory, I could have AI create a prompt, I could have AI create some examples, and then my students could submit their work to me using AI, and then the AI could grade it and give them feedback and a score. And that's something...
It eliminates the need for the teacher.
Well, and that's the problem, right? And so that's one of the reasons why, as awesome as this AI technology is, it is so important that we use whatever benefits it's going to give us, whether it's saving time, you know, giving informal feedback, or just coming up with sub-lesson plans on the fly. You know, all that time that it's going to give us once we learn how to use it, are we going to use that time to get to know our students, to see what's going on, to ultimately help them become better people?
Right. Well, to your point about the prompt, so our co-producer, Toby Gibbs, asked ChatGPT to define and to talk about artificial intelligence and give the pros and cons. And this is what the conclusion came of that. Artificial intelligence has the potential to bring enormous benefits to society, but it also raises several concerns that must be addressed. Ethical considerations, job displacement, accountability, transparency, security risk, and the impact of autonomous weapons are among the many challenges we face. It goes on and on and on. It does give a pretty balanced perspective about AI. It doesn't tip the scales one way or the other. Does that surprise you how often it does seem not to present biases that humans may possess and flow with?
Well, you're always going to find, anytime you're talking about technology, there's always going to be bias that's built into it. Like, it's next to impossible to not have that. But no, it doesn't surprise me at all, because like we've talked about just in these last 10 minutes, like the AI, it's smart. It recognizes that it has those biases built into it, and as they go about training these things more and more, it's one of those reasons why we need to be, if we're going to incorporate them into our instruction as educators, we need to start to ask those questions. We can't just, because it spits out a poem or it spits out a fact, we can't just trust what it tells us. We have to go and fact check.
So trust but verify.
Sure.
Dr. Knautzer, is that the kind of MO that you would have in your approach to this as well?
That's one of the more important aspects of integrating AI into their educational mission, in terms of developing these critical literacies that if you think back to, let's say, the early 1990s with the rise of the internet and the World Wide Web, a very similar disruptive moment for education, for educators, where we had to ask ourselves where legitimate knowledge comes from and how we're going to suddenly navigate this new wealth and source of information that all of our fields of study had yet to reckon with in a really comprehensive way. But fast forward 30 years from then, and here we are in a way where no matter what you study, you're going to be taught how to navigate the information that's out there with an awareness and a sort of critical eye towards it. And that's kind of part of the imperative that we're facing today as educators in integrating AI into education, into our classrooms and our students' learning.
Well, and you made a very interesting point about digital literacies, right? About, well, it's one thing to be able to say artificial intelligence, it's another way to be able to execute it with some skill and dexterity, right? So being taught how to use the technology with some efficacy and values, right, is an important lesson that universities will embrace and make a part of their overall curriculum.
And to understand it more as a black box, where we might put in a prompt and perhaps be very good at putting in prompts and then getting some output that can solve a problem or produce a very good poem or a very good play. But if we understand how it works, how it was made, and where it's going, what the affordances and constraints are, and how we can square all of those with our goals that we're approaching it with in a way that's responsible and ethical, that's the goal there, I think, is not necessarily to where all of a sudden everyone has to become an AI expert,
right,
but then everyone does have to develop these literacies to where in some way our imperative is to reckon with AI in a way that can develop that kind of critical use that we're talking about.
I read a really interesting article that was all about, are we just going to be editors from here on out? And I don't think that that's where it's headed, because again, that takes away the human element of it. And I really hope that we start to celebrate real artists and real poets and real, not just celebrating robot love, but, instead we are trying to figure out, like, okay, if someone's a real artist, if someone's a real writer, if someone wrote this book for real, they're able to play an instrument on the stage in a solo. I want to start to celebrate those kind of things all the more.
Well, and it was interesting at the end of the 60-minute segment of Scott Pelley's About AI, there was a disclaimer that he said might become part of the mainstream. And it's like the previous content that you've just seen was human developed.
Yeah.
Right? And so, talk about your disclaimers about having to actually give credence to the fact, and acknowledge that this was produced by a human and did not have interfacing with artificial intelligence. I want to go to Representative Nima Kulkarni, who's joining us by Skype, and she is at the Southern Legislators Conference in Charleston, so we're so glad that she's taken some time to be with us. Before we talk about autonomous vehicles, which Representative Josh Bray, who is with us in the studio, was a sponsor of, I just want to get your overall concerns when you hear these conversations, whether it's Chat, GPT, and other areas. What are your concerns about it, and are you celebrating this advancement?
Yeah, I think fundamentally what we need to recognize is that AI is a tool. It's a technology that's disruptive, and we have gone through as a species several iterations of disruptive technologies in healthcare and transportation and agriculture. Our world today does not look like it looked 20 years ago, 50 years ago, 100 years ago. So there's a lot of policy implications. There's a lot of impact to occupations and professions. And so I think we need to view AI as a tool that's here. And because of the computer processing speeds that we have, it's likely to grow exponentially in terms of what it can do. But it is a tool that's based on human input. We're hearing about things like AI and having these broader discussions because companies have created ways for us to use them. ChatGPT, you have image generating AI, and those are all private companies that have created ways for us to access this technology. So it's not something that everybody is going to understand immediately. We're not going to understand the potential implications immediately, but I do think that we need to recognize that it's here and that we're going to need to really take a look at it through the lens of how it's going to immediately impact our world and how it's going to impact our world in the near future, in 5 years, in 10 years, because we are in the verge of a very disruptive technology that could be, in terms of our recent history, a bigger impact on our species than the internet. Yeah. And so it's something that we need to be very cognizant of and very careful with, but also recognize its vast potential.
Representative Bray, thank you for being here with us. Your thoughts before we talk about your specific legislation on autonomous vehicles.
As a kid who grew up watching Terminator, it's kind of a fascinating time to be alive because, Skynet looks like it's going to be real. Right. But kind of to echo what Representative Kulkarni said, artificial intelligence is a tool, and we need to be teaching our students, not necessarily like, hey, we need to stay away from this, but how can we use it? Mm-hmm. I was in high school 20 years ago, and I had math teachers tell me then, like, hey, you're not going to have a calculator with you everywhere you go. You need to learn how to do this. But, nobody saw this coming, right, where we have it with us, constantly. And if, I wish I had spent more time then learning how to use Excel and not just how to use, broad equations, but how can I tailor that through technology? Because that would have been pretty handy, right about now. But we are on the precipice of something that is, straight out of a science fiction novel. And it's really exciting, but at the same time, it's a little bit scary because, of the potential of job displacement. You look, GPT-4, it passed the bar exam, it passed, the medical licensing exam. So you're talking about professional people who could be losing their jobs. Just kind of doing research and seeing where all this is seems to be headed, it does appear like for cancer research or physics or rocket science, whatever, there's a great possibility of it doing tremendous things. But then there's also the kind of the scary side of how do we make sure everything stays contained and that we proceed responsibly.
Right. I want to really parse out a term that Representative Kulkarni said was disruptive. I don't know if that's a positive or negative, but we'll get to that in a moment. So right now we want to show you that there are, of course, some creative uses of AI. A member of our KET family uses ChatGPT to help write bedtime stories for her children. So we caught up with them to find out how it works and why they're embracing this technology at bedtime.
Once upon a time, in a land far away, there lived 4 siblings named Pierce, Charlie, Ireland, and Celtic. So we've been using ChatGPT to do bedtime stories for our kids, and it's been a really fun thing to do. Obviously, we have lots of other books in here that we read, but the ChatGPT has added just kind of a fun little, every once in a while, addition to bedtime. It's really simple. You just open the app, and then you give instructions to write a bedtime story, a children's bedtime story. You can add characters, you can give as much or as little detail about the plot, the characters, and it comes up with these really super cute, very simple stories with our kids' names in them and like different adventures and things. And it's a really kind of unique and fun way to use ChatGPT.
Write a 3 to 5 minute children's story about 4 siblings named Pierce.
They love it mostly because it adds this personal touch to the stories. So they're the characters. They get to kind of like, sometimes we'll ask them questions like, what do you want your adventure to be? What's the setting? What do you want to happen along the way? You know, you can let them kind of build the story with you. And so then they are like invested in the story, they're having more fun, they're doing a lot more of the story telling part of it, which is really cool. And they're kind of learning the different components of a story. You know, you need characters, you need a plot, you need a setting, you need all of these sorts of things. And so they're learning that along the way. They love all the books, but they do love this experience. It's just kind of a storytelling activity.
Once upon a time, there was a little boy.
This felt like a really cool way to kind of introduce it to our kids and have them know what it is, because it's obviously going to be something that's part of their future. They are going to probably use it, they're going to be introduced to it, they're going to know what it is. So I think it's important for them to kind of learn early the good ways that you can use it for good instead of evil, I guess, is one way to look at it. I hope that what they take from that is that while this is fun and silly and we can create these stories that have us as characters, that there is absolutely value in real literature that has stood the test of time, that has you know, been read to them many, many times. So I hope that also is imparted on them in that way, that it is a tool that can be used, but it's not necessarily the best thing to use in all scenarios. And that there's value in books, stories written by real people. And so the siblings' enchanting adventure in the forest became a cherished memory, reminding them to always embrace the wonders of the world while staying safe in the warm embrace of their loved ones. The end.
So, Mr. Piercy, there's nothing like the real thing. There used to be a slogan for a product, and that's what you heard Jackie McCuddy kind of allude to, that there has to be a balance, right? That you still want to get the book off the shelf and read, but these days she has some little kiddos there who were learning AI and probably know more about it than many of us.
Well, I think it's important to recognize, and we've kind of hinted at this already, but where we are with AI, we're kind of at the, to use an analogy for kids from my age group, but you know, it's kind of, we're at the Atari 2600 of AI.
Which is my favorite. I love
That's where
that.
we are now, Pitfall and all, that was great. But we recognize that it's only going to get better, right? It's only going to get better. So I do think it's very, very important that we start to model for our students the ways that we can use this in positive ways outside of just using it to answer quick questions for us. And I feel like that's going to be kind of the sweet spot. And right now, I mean, this technology, especially ChatGPT-3, it's less than a year old. So we as educators, we are still trying to figure out, like, how does this fit into our instruction? What does this mean for, like, college admissions procedures? What does it mean for all that? These are good questions to start to ask. But and it's going to be things that over the next few years, like in the education field, we're going to have to figure out those answers too. But yes, I still believe there is nothing like the real thing, and there's a reason why I still do a read aloud every single day with my kids at home and also with the students in my classroom.
Yeah.
Written by a human.
Written by a human. That has to have that disclaimer. Dr. Yampolsky, I want to toss out to you a couple of questions that we've gotten in from our viewers tonight. This from a viewer, quote, with the rise of electric vehicles and the impending rise of AI almost in parallel, it would seem that both of these technologies will require short and long-term electricity that our current alternatives to coal cannot provide. What does the short and long-term demands of these technologies mean for coal in Kentucky? Can you answer that?
I don't know anything about coal in Kentucky. I know that leaders of some of those companies think we may be 2 to 4 years away from superintelligence. And so all the problems we're discussing, like climate change, may become completely irrelevant. Either those systems solve that for us completely, or we will not be around to deal with that problem. So it's important to spend some time looking at what can happen, not just immediate, not just next semester, but what about 5 years from now if we are successful at making this technology disrupt everything, economy, military, science? And I think we're not doing enough as scientists, as politicians, as citizens.
So, yeah, so you're thinking that the policy making is really lagging behind how fast the technology is evolving, correct?
Absolutely. I think those immediate problems are very serious and they impact people, but they also distract you from what is really impactful. We have algorithmic bias problems, we have technological unemployment, but none of it would matter if the superintelligence is out of control and kills everyone. And it used to be science fiction. It used to be 50 years ago. Now we have leaders of those top AI labs saying we need to solve this problem now or we're all dead. And no one really pays attention and people switch back to the favorite topic of their choosing.
Right. So this question from Jeff Sims from Caldwell County, and I'll let you or others chime in, and it's for the legislators in particular. How will developments in medicine and treatment drugs be patented and monetized when developed by AI? Will there be cost protections for consumers in Kentucky? You given some thought to that, Representative Bray?
That's a great question. The policy making has lagged behind this, and part of the reason behind it is we don't necessarily understand, what AI is truly capable of, and the advancements are happening so exponentially fast now that it's hard for us to keep up. Going back to that, I mean that's a federal issue that needs to be handled at the federal level. We can pass something through the state, but you've got 49 other states, and I don't know how effective that would be.
So you would be for some kind of uniform, standardized federal law to kind of govern how all of this is approached. Same question to you, Representative Kulkarni. I mean, in the policy-making space, it hasn't kept pace with how this is evolving so quickly. So should Kentucky wait for the feds to step in and create policy that states should follow, or should states go out on their own?
I believe that we need to do this on our own. We cannot wait for states to catch up to what federal policy may or may not be enacted. And I'll just throw out Real ID as an example. I mean, it's taken about 20 years for 50 states to do an upgrade to our identification, right, our driver's licenses. And the interpretation of what a federal law would look like, the implications of what would be in that federal law, I think are not necessarily going to look the same state by state. So a lot of concerns that were brought up, for instance, with Rep. Bray's bill, and I didn't mean to pick on this specifically, but had to do with Eastern Kentucky. A lot of Eastern Kentucky lawmakers were concerned with the roads in Eastern Kentucky, the lack of consistent broadband or signal in Eastern Kentucky. That may not look the same in another state. So I think a uniform federal law is not going to be sufficient to address all of the needs that Kentuckians have. I think that we need to take the lead on this because our people are going to be impacted first. And the speed at which all of this is happening is something we cannot dismiss. By the time we figured out how much social media impacted all of us and has impacted a generation, it's already done, right? So we're just studying what has already happened. And I'm still processing a little bit what Dr. Yampolsky was saying, but it can be dire. But if we just study and understand and learn about what this tool can do and what its implications are. If we do that well, then we'll be able to enact policies that reflect what those gaps are or what those opportunities are.
Well, yes, Dr. Yampolsky, I think you want to chime in here.
Yes, so historically, absolutely correctly, everyone's saying AI is a tool. That's what it always was. We had narrow AI, help me do my taxes, help me win this chess game. Then you have general intelligence. Then you go beyond human capacity to superintelligence. It stops being a tool, it becomes an agent, an independent agent, an agent we don't know how to control. In fact, there are publications saying it may be impossible to do it. So this idea that that's just another version of software, a new Word, new internet browser, is not quite capturing the change. It's a complete paradigm shift to where we are no longer possibly in charge. We are not the smartest species around, and we don't know how to remain in control. There is nothing you have to contribute. You can contribute to a superintelligence. It's a better artist. It's a better writer, it's a better programmer. Yes, we have man-made niche products some people find interesting, but it's not enough to sustain 8 billion humans.
There's a term, Professor Yampolsky, that we hear a lot, and that's generative AI. AI. What is that? What does that mean?
So we have AI capable of generating art, generating images, generating computer code, generating text, generating all sorts of digital media. And there is really no limit to that. It can generate video games, it can generate full videos, it can generate whole universes given access to physics simulators. So a lot of people are thinking that what we see from Apple and Meta with virtual reality, with augmented reality, is the world we are shifting towards. There is no reason to waste precious physical resources if you can get comparable experience in virtual space. Of course, all of it depends on us being able to control those systems and still be around to enjoy those.
Mm-hmm. I'll let you chime in if you'd like, Professor Knatzer.
Well, to go back to kind of questions of policy that we were discussing a little bit earlier, from kind of an institutional level to think about higher education or any kind of school system, there are certain things that we know that we want to have at kind of a broad level in terms of teaching students critical literacies, in terms of making sure that we're using AI platforms reasonably, safely, and responsibly in that case. But kind of akin to this question of, whether states or the federal government, then what we see happening is that there's different kind of areas of specialization, fields of study that then kind of break apart and need to consider on their own what the meaning of all this is. And we actually have lots of people asking very existential questions at this point about what it means to do what they do, whether it's in the workforce or in an academic area of study. And my personal area is in writing studies, and it's a very interesting question to think about what the meaning of my field of study is. Now that there is a generative platform that can generate text, it's something that's not a human agent, that can produce something that theoretically is entirely new, has never existed before. And now, of course, there's arguments that it's not entirely creative because it's reproducing a statistical norm in a rather large data set, and it's not that novel. But it's nevertheless writing in a way that we couldn't have imagined perhaps a few years ago because we hadn't seen something do that. And so we're kind of having to plumb our imaginations in terms of what it means to do what we do in different ways, whether we do writing studies or medicine or public health. And we're having to figure out sort of in our own areas what the uses, abuses, what the different ways of leveraging AI are, and also figure out what it means to study what we do now that there's this production capability for those who do art. It can produce a visual image, but is that creativity? Is that producing art, or is it some other kind of action? And those are really interesting conversations. I think the things that will take a lot of time to sift through.
Yeah, Representative Kulkarni.
Yeah, I just wanted to I agree with everything that everyone is saying. I think what we need to realize is the exponential speed at which all of this is going to happen. And to Professor or Dr. Yamalski's point, how we treat it and the policies that we put into place right now are how we will control and regulate its growth. Using the word intelligence, right? Human intelligence is what we've used to separate ourselves from every other species on the planet. And so you put artificial intelligence in the mix, and that's what scares people, is that word intelligence, because what does it mean to be human anymore? So they are existential questions, but we need to be looking at the disruptions, not just in terms of occupations, not just in terms of states and countries, because at some point those may become meaningless. What we're talking about is a resource that is able to take all of the data that we have so far in digital recorded history, and we can put in a prompt and have it allocate resources the most efficient way. We can put in a prompt and we can get answers to things that may take years and years for our current computing powers to get to the answer. So I think what we need to be looking at is not necessarily one individual occupation or one individual state or federal. I think there is a very macro picture that needs to be taken by all of us, because the disruption could be, to Dr. Canaster's point, right, the art world is having all kinds of issues, right? You have to say you used AI to generate this image. We're having a harder and harder time distinguishing with our human brain power, images that are fake, videos that are fake, voices that are fake. And by fake, I mean AI generated, which brings into question, what do we own? So every prompt that you put in, and just like in a search engine, every prompt that you put in is a piece of data that can be used by a company. Are they being regulated? Do we have a system to even look at who owns that data, right? So apart from the liability aspect, when you talk about something like autonomous vehicles or anything like that, who is responsible for any damage done by an AI-generated image or AI-generated text? For instance, there's an example of an attorney that used AI to generate a legal brief that looked facially perfect, but the citations weren't to any real cases. And so it takes some human scrutiny and some level of analysis still to make sure that it is accurate, because AI is going to be compelled to give you an answer to your prompt, whether it's true or not. And so while it is still dependent on our input, while we can still train it, I think that we need to take a really long view, a very bird's eye view of what all of the implications are. I personally believe a lot of the disruptions are going to be in education, right? In terms of what degrees do we need if we can just sort of skip ahead, and you don't, to Representative Ray's point, you don't need a calculator anymore. Nobody anticipated smartphones at that point. So I think that there's a lot of discussion about very specific things, but the technology itself is much broader and much bigger than any one issue or any one implication that we may be talking about today.
Well, to get back to a point earlier about policy, lawmakers in more than 30 states, according to the National Conference of State Legislatures, have considered AI legislation. Kentucky had the autonomous vehicle legislation that Representative Josh Bray, who's with us, House Bill 135, sponsored. It did pass, but it was vetoed by the governor. The legislature, Republican dominated, chose not to override it on the final day of the session, but it would have set up a framework for allowing fully autonomous vehicles on public highways in Kentucky. Why didn't it get over the finish line?
So we run into, it was, short session, just ran out of time. We passed it on the last day of session, didn't have the ability to come in and override the governor's veto. Look, it was a new concept, and we hadn't filed a bill like that before. And, when you start trying to talk about autonomous vehicles with people, they kind of look at you like you got three heads, because, who can imagine a car driving itself? But the fact is that there are 30-something states, 27, 30 states now that have passed this, Mississippi being the most recent. And, they're so much safer than what human drivers can do. One of the big concerns is safety, and it's kind of just the unfamiliarity with it, because the idea of a car kind of driving itself from point A to point B, we're just not comfortable with. But when you look at the actual data, we've got over 1,000 fatalities in Kentucky every year. Every weekend, if you watch the news, there's been a fatality somewhere, and 86-90% of those are because of human error or human inattention, or not following the law. And the truth is, autonomous vehicles, they're always paying attention. They can't break the law. So the safety issue.
Can they respond to an emergency situation where they need to actually physically brake?
Oh, absolutely. That's part of the framework that we were looking at. They have to be able to go into a condition that's safe. If they come upon a wreck and they can't get around it, they have to pull off to the side of the road. Hazards come on. If you get inclement weather, have to do the same thing, and they're constantly being monitored. It's not like these things are just out on their own.
And there can be some capacity for human override.
Oh, absolutely. So in a short session, it was just an immense time crunch with something so complicated. And it's kind of the same issues with talking about policy for AI. We have formed a working group to look at some of the things we can do on transparency, on employment practices, on discrimination, on biases. That is being looked at, but it's just such a complicated issue. And in a 30-day session or a 60-day session, when you've got all of these, you're trying to get a budget out, and you've got all of these other priorities, it's just really difficult to explain to people kind of what you're trying to do when the average person probably isn't keeping up with the technology and what it can do, and what the opportunities are. One of the issues that was brought up was, kind of along with AI, is the potential for job displacement. But when you look at in the transportation sector, we're down 80,000 truckers nationwide. And you look at what's going on in Texas right now. They've got automated programs where they're delivering freight. They've been doing it for about a year now, no issues. We look at farmers in Western Kentucky. They're planting their crops, they're harvesting their crops, and it's all automated. People don't think about that, but their tractors, their planters, their combines, all of that's done with GPS, and it's just automated. And so the technology's there. It's absolutely safe. And we will be filing it again at the first part of next session.
Well, there was a healthy contingent, both of Democrats and Republicans, who voted against it, right? That job displacement being one of those concerns. So do you think that the conversation will move and change some of those minds to align with the bill?
I do. Listen, absolutely. Like I said, it's so complicated, the issue, and you've got to be comfortable with it. I mean, do you want to have to go back home to your constituents and explain something? Hey, we're voted to turn cars loose without a driver on the road. We have to make legislators comfortable with it. We have to make sure that people know that these things are safe. They're going on all around us: West Virginia, Tennessee, North Carolina, Missouri, Mississippi. All of these states have authorized this. Ohio has authorized the testing of it. It's a tremendous economic development opportunity just from Kentucky's diverse landscape. We've got flat land out in Western Kentucky where the roads are absolutely straight, and we've got curvy mountain roads up in Eastern Kentucky. We've got cities, Louisville, Lexington, Northern Kentucky, and just thinking about in Northern Kentucky, the distribution hub out of the Northern Kentucky Airport, Amazon, all of that, a tremendous economic development opportunity. We watched these huge investments come in these other states, and Kentucky, it's time for us to kind of start leading the way on some of these things.
And does our road infrastructure, does it even keep pace with autonomous vehicles? I'm thinking about in some of the more challenging terrain in Eastern Kentucky.
It does. And listen, in speaking with the transportation department, when they're designing these roads, they're they've got this stuff in mind. Their turn radiuses, painting, stuff like that. It absolutely does. But one of the things that I think was hard to understand is there was a fear that all of a sudden, we legalized these, and tomorrow you're going to see driverless cars going all across the state, and that couldn't be further from the truth, because they've got to come in, they've got to test these things. They have to make sure they're safe. They have to map them. They've got to install their infrastructure, because there's a tremendous infrastructure that goes in there for every company. For every one job that could be displaced, they anticipate 8 more jobs created just to maintain these things, from programming. All of this, it's a tremendous opportunity that Kentucky needs to be able to take advantage of.
Well, and to also create the highly skilled workforce to be able to keep up with that, it'd be another challenge perhaps for Kentucky as well.
That's exactly right.
Representative Kulkarni, I want you to weigh in, because you were one of the 40 no votes, I believe, on House Bill 135 of the last legislative session that ended March 30th. Tell us about your opposition.
Yeah, and I agree with Representative Bray in terms of conceptually the opportunity for something like autonomous vehicles. I mean, I think it's going to happen. I don't think we're anywhere near having that technology yet. We don't know how safe it is. We don't know how it reacts to emergencies. We don't know who is in charge of regulating that. Are these private companies that have fleets of these vehicles? Is there any government regulation at all? Is there any safety and oversight for individuals? And those were some of the concerns that were brought up, right? In addition to the job displacement aspect of it, is the liability piece. Who actually is going to be responsible for somebody getting hurt? We don't know how AI responds in a situation where they might be having to hit a pedestrian or avoid hitting more pedestrians on the side. Like, do they have to swerve? How do they deal with a rainy road? How do they deal with inclement weather? How do they deal with the hilly, curvy roads in eastern Kentucky? There's just a lot of uncertainty surrounding this technology, as there is with any new technology. And all of this was brought up. And there's a lot of reasons why we need to not necessarily just start looking at it from a liability perspective and an economic development perspective, because this technology, in conjunction with AI, we use that already, right? We have assistive technologies in cars right now. And in autonomous vehicles, we'll use a combination of sensors and cameras and radar and satellite and AI to make sure that the vehicle itself is en route, on the safest route. There's not any obstacles. But we have to understand how it reacts to a situation. It's not going to do it the same way that a human does. And I also agree that there is a lot of human error when we are on the roads today. I don't think I need to tell anybody about people being inattentive drivers or not paying attention. But I think that we have to study the issue. I think we need to not only study the issue from a job displacement standpoint, but we need to study the issue in terms of who owns this technology, how are they deploying this technology, and where are they doing it? Because I think we need to really understand the implications of the broader picture here. We cannot simply look at one small piece and say, this looks great and it's going to save some money for somebody. I think that we have to look at the broader implications of all of this technology. And I think that's why states like New York and New Jersey have created task forces and pilot programs and monitoring programs where a human is involved. Because until we get to that point, I don't know that we as policymakers have enough of an understanding or enough information, enough data for ourselves on this technology to understand how to use it safely and how to make sure that we transition into use this on a broad scope to the best way that we can for our communities.
I want to go to Dr. Yampolsky about this, just to ask your opinion about autonomous or self-driving vehicles as an example of artificial intelligence. Your thoughts?
Well, they have potential to save many lives. They obviously pay attention much better. They don't get drunk most of the time, so there is a lot to be said. They can also coordinate with other vehicles. If you have enough of them on the road, it would be a great improvement. They are not good in novel situations. They're very good on a highway, going straight, keeping the lane, but if something unusual happens, a lot of times we get completely lost, and that could be an optical illusion. The sun hits a surface at a certain angle, the color is novel, and they get confused. So you still need humans in the loop for now. Long term, obviously, that's going to be one of the great success stories for AI where we can fully automate transportation. Eventually, we'll automate most jobs. Short term, we're going to create awesome novel jobs, such as prompt engineer, and that's what universities are there for, to figure out what majors will be useful in a couple years and guiding students towards those majors and away from kind of dead-end occupations, which will be automated before they graduate. But long term, all jobs will be replaced. I mean, if you have a super intelligent system, there is nothing you can contribute, as I said before.
So I do want, as I only have just a few short minutes left in our program, earlier this afternoon I talked with Boyce College professor Dr. Jason Thacker, who teaches philosophy and ethics and worldview, and he's also written a book about AI. And here's what he had to say today. Professor Thacker, thank you so much for joining us. You are also an author. Your book, The Age of AI, is something that we want to talk about because that is our topic on Kentucky Tonight this evening. We appreciate your time.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me, Renee.
So talk to us about how the AI, artificial intelligence expansion, and what it means could disrupt humanity as you see it. Do you see it as a disruption to humanity, and what are your concerns about it?
Yeah, it's really interesting with the conversation surrounding AI. For many, many years, we could kind of keep this technology at arm's length. We thought it was something one day we might have to address and have to think through. But reality is all of us have been utilizing artificial intelligence really every single day for many, many years, from communication platforms to things we purchase and shop online to a host of different tools and technologies. But with generative AI that we saw released 10 and 12 months ago now, really popularized a lot of artificial intelligence, is raising some really interesting questions that I think it's really pressing and helpful for all of us to step in on, to think deeply about the big questions, the fundamental kind of existential questions that AI is causing us to ask.
And what are those questions that you're asking when it comes to AI?
Yeah, there's a host of issues, but I think at the core, especially with generative AI, we're having these big, deep questions about what does it mean to be human? And the reality is a lot of these fundamental questions that we're asking now about AI are really not novel or new questions at all. They're questions that we've really always asked as humanity, but we're just asking them in light of some of the new opportunities, some of the new challenges and opportunities before us. So with AI, I think we're uniquely asking questions of what does it mean to be human? And one of the things that through my work and through the work that I continue to do in the classroom and writing and different things is just reminding folks where human dignity lies. It isn't reliant on the things we do. It isn't that our value, our worth, our dignity is based on what we do, but who we are. As from my faith perspective, as image bearers of the Almighty God, that is the root and the core of human dignity that I think needs to be center and needs to really be center stage on any type of regulation that we consider, any type of uses that we consider, to make sure that we keep the primacy of what it means to be human really at the center of these conversations.
And as you mentioned, Professor, AI has been around for a long time in some shape, form, or fashion, particularly in medical fields, from cochlear implants to other devices that help with mobility. So is now a particular concerning time as we see this burgeoning technology really take root, and we're understanding more and more, or perhaps trying to understand more and more each day? Why is it a threat now more so than perhaps it would have been 10 years ago?
I think a lot of it comes down to especially with generative AI, we're having this fundamental question of what does it mean to be human kind of get thrust into the center of the conversation, because we've long assumed of what it meant to be human was based on the things we do in terms of creativity or writing or thinking and processing. And now we're starting to see these generative AI systems be able to create things, to make things, to write text, to make video, audio, all sorts of different things. And I think that's fundamentally challenging a lot of the assumptions of what we thought it meant to be human. But when we step back and realize that these tools, they're not neutral. They have values, they have designs, they have purposes. So when we start to think about how technology is forming and shaping us, I think AI presents an opportunity for us to really step in, to examine the nature of technology. What is it? How is it forming and shaping us as people? And then what do we do about it? From my faith perspective of understanding kind of the centrality of Christian ethics is focused on the nature of loving God and loving our neighbor as ourselves. That's really centered on that concept of human dignity. And I think that really has to be the center of all of these conversations, whether we're talking about regulation or whether we're talking about the industry itself, or as users engaging in these technologies, to be really thoughtful and to slow down and to ask some of these fundamental and at times very difficult questions to address really a lot of the challenges and opportunities before us.
Well, Professor Thacker, The Age of AI is your book, and we appreciate you joining us. You're also a professor at Boys College in Louisville, and you're joining us from our Louisville studio. We appreciate these few minutes to get your perspective on this, and we hope to be able to speak with you again. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much, Renee.
So as we wrap up with about 90 seconds remaining, I'd go to you, Dr. Knatzler, about you had made similar points as Mr. Thacker earlier about the human elements of this as well. And I'll let you have some final thoughts about that.
I'd like to just echo a little bit that language in my context, in that this is, for me and for lots of us who work in education, kind of a search for an inquiry into where the dignity of education is in the context of all of these new developments that maybe at face value seem to be a refutation of what we have done in the classroom. But we're trying to reframe it as an invitation, as a way to proceed with informed caution but energetic curiosity to inquire into how this could be leveraged and how we could innovate what we're doing in a way that's responsible, in a way that's sort of productive, and again, preserves this enterprise of educating that we're still invested in at a very human level.
Yeah. Well, we'll have to leave it there. Gentlemen, and Representative Kulkarni, we thank you for being with us. Representative Bray, thank you all for joining us this evening. We'll be following this topic more as we go along, and particularly as the legislature takes up this issue and more. Next week on Kentucky Tonight, we'll talk about Kentucky's energy needs. And be sure to join us each weeknight at 6:30 Eastern, 5:30 Central for Kentucky Edition. And Bill Bryant and a team of working journalists will be here Friday night to discuss the week's news. I'm Renee Shaw. Thanks for joining us. Good night.